Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Britannia Lounge for this afternoon's lecture. Today, ladies and gentlemen, is the final lecture by this young gentleman here. It's Keith Appleyard, and today he's talking about Bletchley Park. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Keith Appleyard. Thank you.
Well, it's a long time since I've been called young, so thank you very much for the introduction. So this, yes, as was stated, this is actually the final lecture, at least for this cruise. And to tell you the truth, it's one of my favourites. I'd like to talk to you, as the title suggests, about what happened at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. Now, you might wonder why, because it's actually a well-known story now. It wasn't for 25 years, but everyone now knows what happened at Bletchley Park. But I actually think it's worth telling again, because it's a smashing story. And also, it shows a lot of sort of quirky things. It's a picture of of a time and a place which will never happen again. Certainly couldn't happen now. And it reflects English society, it seems to me, the way people behaved and some of their really great qualities. So the first thing is, what happened at Bletchley Park? Well, in a phrase, that is a place where a team of British cryptanalysts broke the German codes pretty well throughout the war, and the Germans never found out. So how important was that? Well, this man, who is Sir Harry Hinsley, who is actually the official historian of biographer of intelligence matters in the Second World War, he thought it was pretty important. That's what he said. Ultra, by which mean all the stuff that came out of Bletchley Park, shortened the war by not less than 2 years and probably by 4. Moreover, in the absence of Ultra, it's uncertain how the war would have ended. Now, that's pretty big stuff. It's the sort of claim that you get and hear from the effect of dropping the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So what I'd like to do today is try and examine that and tell you what happened at Bletchley Park. I've structured it into a few sections. First of all, what the origins. It didn't actually start in 1939. It happens a lot that went on beforehand. And then, enigma, the problem. This was the problem. This was the German machine whose code had to be broken. How was it done? And have a look at whether you think that Harry Hinsley's verdict was valid or not. What is the evidence for it? And finally, how on earth was this secret kept? So let's start with the origins. As I say, eavesdropping as such didn't start in 1939. It had been going on a long time. In fact, during the First World War, there was a signals intelligence operation. It was run mainly out of the Admiralty, a room called Room 40, led by the Director of Naval Intelligence, Sir Hugh Sinclair, or Hugh Sinclair as he was then. And they had a lot of success in breaking German naval codes. At the end of the First World War, they didn't just stop. The organization continued, and Sinclair became the head of a new organization, which we now know as MI6, Secret Intelligence Service. And the eavesdropping bit was a section of this. That was in 1919. The targets were mainly focused on the newly formed Soviet Union and Russia, and they operated from 1925 onwards out of that building. It's Broadway Buildings, which is just opposite St James's Tube Station. And as I say, the man in charge of the whole kabang was this guy, Hugh Sinclair. Working for him was the head of the eavesdropping section, which was actually called the Government Code and Cipher School, GCCS. And the man there in charge was Alistair Denniston. Now, during the 1920s, they were happily intercepting a whole load of stuff from Russia. And it was pretty late in the day when they suddenly realized that there was another threat. After 1933 and the election of Hitler as Chancellor, it soon became pretty obvious that Nazi Germany was going to be a much greater threat to the United Kingdom. And the invasion of various countries in Europe, the technique of blitzkrieg, meant that that building was pretty insecure. It was pretty sure that the Germans, if ever a war came, would actually target London. They wanted somewhere safer, out of the way, that wasn't such an obvious target. And what happened in 1938 was this building came on the market. You may recognize it as the mansion at Bletchley Park. And a property developer decided he wanted to buy it, knock it down, and build houses. As far as Denniston and Sinclair were concerned, this was the ideal place. It was near to Fenny Stratford, which was a big post office communications hub. It was near London. It was also near, with good access to Oxford and Cambridge. What's the point of that? To be explained in a few minutes. And it came on the market. Now here we have this sort of strange, only in England type quirkiness that you certainly wouldn't get now. Because what happened was, once they put their bid in, there was an almighty row between various government departments as to who was going to pay for it. MI6 was part of the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office said, yeah, this is a pretty good idea, but we think the Army, Navy and Air Force should pay for it because they're the customers. And the Army, Navy and Air Force said, we think this is a pretty good idea, but the Foreign Office should pay for it because it's MI6 and GCCS's baby. And this went on, and it became fairly clear that that wrangle would actually mean inevitably the sale would be lost. So Hugh Sinclair bought it with his own money. Can you imagine that happening today? I can't. If any of you would like to do a bit of research, try and find out for me, could you, if Sinclair got his money back? Because I can't find out. He actually died fairly early in the war. However, it was purchased and they started moving people in. There's an early picture of some of the first arrivals, known as Captain Ridley's shooting party, would you believe? And there was a sense of urgency now. This is early 1939. They started laying cables. Why was it so urgent? This is where we go on to the second part of the talk. It was urgent because of this problem, which will go by the name of Enigma. What is Enigma? Well, I've got a short video, which hopefully I'll get to work in a minute, which gives a bit of background.
Since the mid-1930s, all the German armed forces and intelligence departments had adopted a standard machine for encoding their messages. The cipher machine E, better known as Enigma. It was developed in the early 1920s as a handy tool for businessmen to keep commercial messages secret. It was powered by a battery, and its encoded messages were transmitted in Morse code to be decoded on a second Enigma machine at the receiving end. The critical element of the machine was 3 rotors, which could be set to scramble the message in a way which could only be unscrambled by another machine with the same settings. The rotors could be replaced and set differently. As a result, each letter typed could come up in any one of 150 million ways. Given the almost infinite number of settings, it was not surprising that the Germans remained convinced throughout the war that Enigma was uncrackable.
And it's not surprising. I actually think that 150 million is a low estimate. I suspect the odds of breaking this by chance, you could probably win 3 lotteries and still not make up to the odds. So the codes were actually broken. This is the story of Bletchley Park. And also, of course, the great secret is that it must be kept secret. Because if the Germans ever discovered the codes were broken, then clearly they'd change the whole system and everything would be lost. So I'd like just to look at a bit more detail about that machine. There it is. What you see is something that looks like a sort of chunky typewriter. And you've got the keyboard, the standard QWERTY keyboard you can see there, and the lamp board above. If you press a key, one of those lamps lights up. There's all sorts of other stuff about a plug board at the beginning, excuse me, at the front. Don't worry about that, it just increases the odds. The real key to the machine is the 3 rotors you can see at the top. Here's a enlarged picture of them. These rotors have got 26 ratchets on each one, same as the letters of the alphabet, and they're separated and they're put in differently each day. The thing is, how does an operator know how to put the rotors in and where to set them? Well, the basis of that is what is called a key sheet. Here is one. You probably won't be able to read that because I'll enlarge it in a moment. But that's a Luftwaffe key sheet, and it lasts for a month. So if you were an operator, you'd have one of these things, and right down the side there, extreme left-hand side, are the days of the month. So on the 22nd, which is today, you would set the rotors up in a particular way. And I'll enlarge the top left-hand corner of that, so hopefully you might be able to see it a bit better. And you could perhaps see the column down on the left there goes from 31 down to, you can see, to 22. The next bit is the actual number of the rotor, but the key thing is the 3rd column. So if we look at the top one, 31st of the month, on that day, you would set rotor number 1 at 14, rotor number 5 at 9, and rotor number 24, so number 3 at 24. And then the next day, you change it. So whatever codes came out of this, they were changed every 24 hours. So imagine for a second you're an operator. How would you work this? Well, there's a picture of, there's the old Enigma machine you'll see on the picture there, and 2 people operating it. Imagine an officer has given a message he wants to send to his units in the field. He gives the message to the operator who you see in the foreground. And it's in German. And what he does is just type it in by pressing the QWERTY keyboard. As he does so, every time he presses a letter, a letter lights up on the lamp board. And the second guy copies that down. So now, instead of having straightforward message in German, you've got a pile of gobbledygook. They then take the message to the cipher clerk, who sends it to wherever it's going by radio using Morse code. And at the other end, you'll get something like this. Oh, look, there's an Enigma machine in the bottom, right in the bottom middle of the picture. And again, 2 operators and an officer. They've received a message, someone's taken the Morse code down, and they've put down the gobbledygook and handed it to the man in the front. He can't understand it, not surprisingly, because it's encrypted, but hey presto, what he does is he goes ahead and presses his QWERTY keyboard, and as soon as he presses a key, the lamp board lights up, and the second man copies down what the lighted letters are. And hopefully they will be in plain German. He then hands it to his officer, and off they go and do what they're told. So that is how it worked. How on earth do you solve a problem like that? Well, you've got to get the right people for a start. People like this. You probably recognize him. Exactly, Alan Turing. And what Alistair Denniston did was go round his old mates at Oxford and Cambridge, recruiting what he called men of the professor type to come and work on this problem. Turing was a brilliant mathematician. who'd got a special interest in encryption and decryption, and an even more special interest in machines. He had a philosophy about this. He believed that when it came down to it, the Enigma machine was just that. It was a machine. And therefore, logically, if that machine could encrypt messages, it should be possible to design another machine which will decrypt them. And that's what he started working on. And Alistair Denniston recruited a whole lot of people, cryptanalysts like Alan Turing. They included chess players. Hugh Alexander, international chess player with an interest also in cryptanalysis. Another chess player, Gordon Welshman, academic mathematician at Cambridge. And occasionally, outside Oxford and Cambridge, some senior civil servants. Stuart Milner Barry, civil servant, also a chess player, all with this interest in cryptanalysis. Now, that's an interesting way of recruiting people, isn't it? Can you imagine that today? You go around your mates at Oxford and Cambridge and say, would you like to come and work for me? I can't tell you what it is, but it's very important and it'll challenge you. And he recruited a nucleus of cryptanalysts like this, who were the people who were responsible eventually for solving that particular problem. Interestingly, before we go off the business of who was recruited, at any one time, there were probably about 5,000 people working at Bletchley Park. Between 75 and 80% of those people were actually women. Very unusual at the time. They did all sorts of jobs. There were some cryptanalysts as well. Mavis Batty, Margaret Rock, Joan Murray, Ruth Briggs, in between them were responsible for breaking the German Abwehr code, German military intelligence, allowed Britain to control the German spy network in Britain pretty well throughout the war. And also you've got Wrens who are operating the machines I'm going to talk about in a minute, and also people, admin assistants and clerical staff like that. I always found that quite interesting. So, get the right people. And in fact, the British had, I think, about 3 advantages to break this problem. The first advantage is they already had a machine. This machine had been given to them by, would you believe, the Polish Cipher Bureau, who'd been working on it for about 10 years. And as the German threat got closer and closer, they actually went to Paris to meet the French SIGINT organization and Alistair Denniston. And they basically told them what they'd done. They managed to take the machine to bits, worked out how it worked, and they actually gave one of the replicas, which then went back to Bletchley Park. You know, there's a lot of brilliant people working on that in the Polish Cipher Bureau, and they actually managed to break it. But the trouble is, of course, they took a long time to do it. There's not much point in translating a message and decrypting it if it takes you 7 months to do it, because by that time it's old news, completely out of date. But the contribution from the Polish Cipher Bureau was actually critical. The second advantage is they had friends in high places. There's a friend. Winston Churchill visited Bletchley Park in September 1941 and was vastly impressed with what he saw. He saw the potential, you see. He saw that if we could, the British could get advance notice of what the Germans were doing by reading their messages, it gave a tremendous advantage to British commanders. So he was impressed and he went away. But meantime, the people like Turing and Denniston were getting increasingly frustrated, again, because of government bureaucracy. They didn't get enough people, not enough people to operate the machines, and they were being starved of resources. In fact, and this is another of these only in England could this happen moments, the 4 people I showed pictures of before, Turing, Alexander, Welshman, and Milner Barry, wrote a letter pleading with Churchill to give them more resources, because otherwise the whole thing wouldn't work. Not only did they write a letter, but Stuart Milner Barry physically went to London, walked up Downing Street, and handed it in. Now, what response do you think if we decided to hand in a letter to Theresa May? What happened in that circumstance is that within hours, Churchill had written one of his action this day notices. Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority and report to me that this has been done. So from that moment onwards, you could not say that Bletchley Park was under-resourced. The third advantage that the British had was there was actually a weakness in the machines. In fact, 2 or 3 weaknesses. One is a mathematical one, and that is that no letter could ever be encrypted as itself. In other words, if you press A on the keyboard, anything could come up, but it knew it wouldn't be the letter A. And my mathematical friends say this is actually a significant thing that cryptanalysts can work on. The second thing is that poor security in messages gave cribs. By cribs means that the cryptanalyst can actually make a guess at what the message might contain. And when you work it out, Enigma was in some ways a victim of its own success. It was so portable, it was so convenient, seemed to be completely invulnerable to being the code should be broken. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of these machines. All the German branches of military, diplomacy, economics, all used Enigma machines. And of course, if you've got thousands of machines, you've got thousands of operators. And some are pretty good, but others aren't. They make mistakes. And the sort of mistakes that could be made, for instance, many began with the word Spruchnummer, means message number. So you could actually make a guess that maybe the first few groups will contain that. There's this business of routing reports contained often keine besondere Ereignisse. That actually means nothing to report. Imagine if you're like, you're in the Admiralty in Berlin and you're communicating with U-boats and you just send a message to make sure they're there. And nothing to report comes back. They'd be really short messages. They'd be routine. But at the end of the day, what the cryptanalysts are trying to do is not particularly read the interesting bits of those messages, but to get the position of the rotors for that day. Often ended with the words Heil Hitler. So the cryptanalysts could make guesses. And if they make guesses, they could actually get in, as we'll see in a moment. But how did the process work? If you think back to my earlier talks, it's fairly simple. First thing you've got to do is intercept the messages. And during the Second World War, there were dozens of intercept sites scattered throughout the United Kingdom and in overseas as well. A very big one, for instance, in Cairo. And people like those 2 ladies there spent all the war with headphones on, tuning into a particular network and copying it down. And what they were getting, as you'll probably not be surprised to learn, is gobbledygook. There's a terrific message, 5-letter groups, similar to the ones I've shown on previous lectures. But what a soul-destroying job. They knew it was important. They couldn't talk about it, ever. And yet they couldn't understand it. They needed some sort of really, a particular sense of morale and to go through the war doing jobs like that. What happened when those messages were taken down is they were sent to Bletchley Park. You remember the nice picture I showed of the mansion, which was not actually destroyed. Well, it didn't actually go there. It went instead, excuse me, to huts like that. And if you go to Bletchley Park, those huts still exist. They've been tarted up a little bit now, but nevertheless, most of the work was done in really very basic conditions. And within those huts, we get a machine. A machine that was designed by Alan Turing is called the bomb. And it looks like that. What you look at that, when you look at that, you see what seems to be sort of cotton bobbins in rows of 3. And the system is at base quite simple. All these messages came in, the cryptanalysts looked at them and made guesses as to what they might be. Having made the guesses, they then pass these messages on to the machine operators who actually keyed them into the machine, who started it off, and these things rotated at a great speed until they came to a point where, in searching through the possible combinations of rotor settings, they came to one which might work. The machine would stop, and the people there would then read off those settings that the machine was suggesting, go around the corner to their own machine, put the rotors in, and hopefully, once they started pressing keys, German would come out, as it did in that particular message. You're probably too far away to read that, and my German's pretty ropey as well, but I can see the words Tag, der Unternahme, and so forth, one of the translated messages. So that is basically Enigma, and that is, in very brief terms, how Enigma was decoded. There was another problem, and that was a problem of resource. I said that Churchill gave Bletchley Park all the resources they wanted, but it was still not enough. You imagine the number of messages coming in daily to Bletchley Park, thousands of the things, and they were overwhelmed. They'd managed by end of 1941 to build 20 of those bombs, and they were producing quite a lot of decrypts. But then, into the war, after Pearl Harbor came the United States. And the United States made a much bigger operation possible. There was a deal, you see. On the one hand, they wanted access to British cryptanalytics prestige and knowledge. On the other hand, the British wanted more machines. So they came to a deal, particularly with the US Navy, who agreed to produce more and more bombs. They were in America. There were 20 bombs in Britain in September 1941. By a year later, late 1942, the US Navy alone had produced and built over 120 of those machines, increase it tenfold. And when you look at it, you can see the difference this made. In December 1940, Bletchley Park was managing something like 200 decrypts per month. A year after Pearl Harbor, the combined US and British operation was producing 30,000 decrypts a month. And by the end of the war, that had gone to 90,000. Massive. So, although the expertise was at Bletchley Park, the United States does deserve our support because of the way they helped out in providing that resource. So that, as I say, is about Enigma. Before I go on to the next section, however, there was another machine I'd like to mention. Everyone knows about Enigma, but not everybody knows about a thing called Colossus. And this becomes significant, as you'll see. The Germans had another way of sending messages. They used teleprinters, like that. The difference essentially is it's still a typewriter, you key it in, but instead of putting letters on paper, what it does is punch holes in a piece of tape, like that. And each of those holes, those other holes, represents a letter. If you look at a slightly larger one down there, reading along, you've got to go from A to Z, and there's a different pattern of holes and no holes for each letter. So you end up with paper tape, which is then sent by radio to someone at the other end. Now, there's nothing special about that. It's just plain German. What they did, however, was put a machine in, clip it on to the teleprinter. There it is. And that is, if you like, their teleprinter equivalent of the Enigma machine. And if you look at it, you can see some similarities. Look, there's some rotors there at the front. But there aren't 3, there are 12. So how on earth can anyone manage to break the massive number of combinations if you've got 12 rotors all working in harmony? Amazingly, it was actually done. And it was done through the work of 2 people. The first one, this was called the Tunico, was this man. He's called Bill Tutt. Brilliant, brilliant cryptanalyst and mathematician. He actually got lucky one day in August 1941 because the Germans made a bad mistake. These messages are really important because they're high level. They're the sort of messages that Hitler sent to his generals. And in one message, which was passed between the German embassy in Athens to the German embassy in Vienna, was a very long message, and it was intercepted. Something like 4,000 characters. Actually, a cryptanalyst dreamed to get a message that long. Much more chance of getting into it. And the mistake they made was that this message was sent, and the operator at the receiving end in Vienna must have been half asleep or something because he didn't get it down properly. So he rings his colleague back up and says, "Sorry, mate, didn't get the message, send it again." Now, if that operator who's going to now resend it just copies it all down, then there's no advantage. You just get two copies of the same thing. But he must have been really fed up because he was saying he's got to send all this 4,000 characters again, and he starts making shortcuts. What he does is actually, for instance, Spruch number, he abbreviates it to Spruch NR. Now you've got two messages, which is the same basic text, and he hasn't altered his settings, and they're different. And Tutt got these and started comparing them. And he worked on these messages for something like 3 months, eventually discovering that there was a repetition on every 41 strikes. And from that, mathematically, he managed to break that machine. Took a long time. Months. Now, if that could be done by a machine, just like the bomb dealt with Enigma messages, then there may be a chance of getting in some good intelligence. And that was done as well. And the man responsible for that was that man. He built a machine called Colossus. His name is Tommy Flowers, and he's a different sort of person to the rest I've been talking about. He's actually almost a self-made post office engineer, but brilliant. And he also had this fascination with machines. And he believed he could build a machine which would find out the position of those rotors. And he did so. It's actually called Colossus, and it would fill a room. If you had a Colossus in here, it would just about fill the room. And in doing so, if you go to Bletchley Park, you can see these things in operation. What they're doing is running the paper tape through at a massive, massive speed, looking for the position of the rotors and using cribs, those guesses, where the position of the rotors might be. The secret, as far as Tommy Flowers was concerned, was that mechanical machines were too slow. You needed an electronic machine, a machine with valves. Look at them. Something like 1,500 valves in that machine. Notoriously unreliable. But Flowers realized that they were unreliable because you kept switching them on and off. Go home at night, switch them off. If you left them on all the time, their reliability improved dramatically. And although not many messages were actually decrypted using this, those that were decrypted were very important. I need now to go on to talk a little bit about what was the success. How valid is Harry Hinsley's claim that it shortened the war by 2 years? Well, we can talk about successes till the cows come home. The cruise would end before it finished. I've got 10 minutes. Let me talk about two. The first one is D-Day. And interestingly, the Colossus was built and started translating a few messages just before D-Day. And Eisenhower, would you believe, had a big advantage. I'm not saying D-Day was an easy operation. What I'm saying is he had an advantage because he knew for sure that Hitler believed the invasion was coming on the Pas de Calais, all the way up to June the 6th, 1944. He knew that because several Colossus messages had been translated, decrypted, and passed to Eisenhower. So that's one example. I'll give a second example of enigma this time. The Battle of the Atlantic. That is what Churchill talked about as far as the Battle of the Atlantic was concerned. A dominating factor through the war. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happening elsewhere, land, sea and air, depended ultimately on its outcome. In other words, if the German blockade, the U-boat blockade of Britain, had been successful, we'd have been starved out. And at the start of the war, that seemed a very distinct possibility. And it lasted throughout the war. Over 3,500 merchant ships were sunk. Over 175 warships were sunk. And the U-boat campaign had spectacular success until around February 41. And at that time, the people at Bletchley Park broke the German naval codes. And for a while, they managed to do this because they managed to get hold of a couple of code books and an Enigma machine from a scuttled submarine. And then, of course, the Germans were fairly justified in getting a bit suspicious. Every time the U-boats went out, the convoys went somewhere else. Every time the U-boats appeared in a certain place, then they might be attacked by Allied aircraft. And Karl Dönitz, who was the head of the Kriegsmarine, the German Admiralty at the time, began to have his doubts. He didn't really believe the machine could have been broken. But just in case it was, let's modify the machine. And Dönitz introduced a new Enigma machine for the German Navy. There it is. Looks the same, doesn't it? What's the difference? Yeah, not 3 rotors at the top there, but 4. And immediately, Bletchley Park was blind. And they stayed so like that for something like a year, until another U-boat was scuttled, more code books were actually gained, and in October 1942, they broke the ciphers again. And this lasted throughout the war. And statistically, it was a great success. I can show that with a little graph. If you look at the graph there, what you're seeing along the bottom of the year, starting in 1940 and running to 1945, you can probably ignore the last one because there's only 4 months of it, and look at the graphs. The Allied shipping losses are in red. And you see how they increased dramatically. They're off the chart in 1942. But once they were able to decrypt the 4-rotor machine, look how they drop. Conversely, in blue, you've got U-boat losses, and they're increasing all the way through the war. Good evidence, it seems to me, that the Bletchley Park operation was a significant factor in the U-boat war, Battle of the Atlantic. Okay, let's move on. How do you keep the secret? Because, as we've said, if it was found out, then everything would have been lost. Well, in the first instance, you restrict access. Very few people knew about this operation. Even people working at Bletchley Park didn't know what was going on in the hut next door. But commanders, politicians didn't know. Bomber Harris didn't know. And he insisted on bombing civilian targets in 1944 when the Ultra was saying that oil installations were a vulnerable target. The second way of doing it is you think of another explanation. A good example of this is convoys resupplying Rommel in North Africa from Italy. The Bletchley Park operation was reading a lot. And so they knew where the convoys were, they knew where they were going very, very quickly. And of course, if every time a convoy set out, Allied aircraft appeared overhead, they'd guess as well that the codes might be broken. You need another explanation. And the other explanation was provided by these aircraft. They're Martin Maryland reconnaissance bombers, and they were based in Malta. So what would happen was that Bletchley Park would receive a message about a convoy sailing on a particular day for a particular route. And what would then happen is one of those aircraft at Malta would overfly the convoy, and the people in the convoy would look at them and say, oh, heck, we've been caught again. They would then expect an attack. Interestingly, at the end of the war, one of the German convoy commanders said, during the war, we thought you must have had something like hundreds of aircraft based in Malta, because they always appeared. In fact, there were only 3. So, what about this? Don't talk. People who worked at Bletchley Park were told never to say anything about their work. Notices like that were scattered all over the place. Thousands of posters. And this lasted well beyond the war. As we've seen from previous lectures, it lasted till 1974. Churchill was very succinct in what he said about the Bletchley Park operation. He said this: "They were the geese that laid the golden eggs but never cackled." And if you by chance go to Bletchley Park, in the foyer, you'll see a goose with a golden egg. I actually said no one talked. Not actually quite true. One person talked. That's that man. I don't suppose you'll know who it is. In fact, it's John Cairncross. He's a member of the Cambridge spy ring. He was a Russian spy, or is a British spy who spied for Russia. He was the 5th man. You know, Burgess, Maclean, Philby, Blunt, and Cairncross. Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park for about a year and a half around 1941 in the Luftwaffe Order of Battle Hut. And he passed all his information that he could get to the Soviet Union. He was actually, in the end of the war, given the Order of the Red Banner. I mean, this perhaps isn't as bad as it sounds, because at that time, of course, the Soviet Union was our ally. So Russia knew what Bletchley Park was up to. When Burgess and Maclean fled to Russia and the police raided Burgess's house, they found mention of Cairncross, and it became fairly clear that he was one of the spies. There was no proof, though. He was actually basically told he's lost his job, but there's no evidence enough to prosecute him. He actually went overseas. He worked as a translator in Rome for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN. And when Blunt confessed, he also confessed to being the 5th man. He died in the south of France in 1995. So, what happened to Bletchley Park post-war? Well, in the first instance, it was reduced drastically. Many of the machines were broken up. They ended up with about 1,000 people. In 1947, it was renamed GCHQ, moved to Eastcote, eventually to Cheltenham. Bletchley Park went into some decline and disrepair. It was used for various purposes: post office engineers training, intercept officers training, a teacher training college, but it gradually got worse and worse and worse. Until 1992, when the, sorry, I've gone, go back one. There we are. The Bletchley Park Trust was formed. Bletchley Park Trust put a whole pile of lottery money into it, and it's been renovated, and it's a really good place to go if you're interested in this sort of thing. I'd strongly recommend it. And that really is the end of the talk, but except for a couple of postscripts, funny little stories. 2 stories, in fact, which illustrate the bizarre effects of secrecy, and also, to some extent, the lack of recognition for people who worked at Bletchley Park. The first story concerns, interestingly, Hendon Technical College in the early 1990s. In 1992, Hendon Technical College advertised a course of Introduction for Computers, and were gratified and surprised to find an 87-year-old man enrolling for the course. Not only that, he seemed pretty bright and passed the course. Where are we? That's the man, Tommy Flowers, who built Colossus and really can be credited by being one of the founders and inventors of the computer age. The second story concerns a lady. There she is. She's called Jean Barker. Jean Barker worked in the naval section at Bletchley Park on U-boat intercepts. After the war, she didn't say about what she did, but made a career in local government. She became a politician. She became Mayor of Cambridge, for example, in the early 1970s. And Margaret Thatcher picked her up and made her a life peer in 1980. And until 1974, she never spoke about her work. She did speak a fair bit about it after that, but never hit the headlines. However, in a space of something like 30 seconds, she became extremely famous when an internet clip went viral. Now, this is the internet clip. I'd like to explain what this is about. This is actually a debate in the House of Lords in 2011. And the man speaking is Lord King, previously Tom King. And his point he's making is that it's very important that we keep on remembering Remembrance Day and celebrating it, not least because a lot of people have died and some are growing old, and unless you watch it, it's all going to become a bit distant and academic. What you need to watch, however, is not Tom King. It's the lady behind him, who is actually Jean Barker. But she's not Jean Barker anymore. She is, as we say, Baroness Trumpington, with her life peerage. Watch her as Tom King speaks, only going for about 30 seconds.
The survivors, a few survivors from the First World War were still there. I remember meeting Mr. Harry Patch, who was the last survivor of the lot, I think, and gradually they faded away. And then the survivors of World War II started to look pretty old as well, as my noble friend, the Baroness, reminded me, I believe, claiming to be one of the only survivor, I think, in this house of those who gave great service to their nation.
What do you reckon? That's a good place to stop, don't you think? Yeah, I love that clip. So, we come to the end, not only of this talk, but my series of talks, and just a couple of things to say before I bid goodbye. The first thing is I don't like saying goodbye, and I only tend to say au revoir, because I hope I'll meet you again in some sort of way afterwards. If you want to keep in touch with me, please do so. Excuse me a second. There we go. This is an au revoir, and it's a thank you. It's a thank you to all the people on the ship, people in the box, John, everyone else who's helped and made this possible. But most of all, it's my thanks to you for coming along, talking to me, and being a great audience. I say if you want to keep in touch, you can do. There's an email address. I've got some cards. If you'd like to take them away, please feel free to do so. And it just remains for me to say, I've enjoyed this very much. I hope you have a wonderful time for the rest of the cruise. Thank you so much.